Well, good morning. I hope everybody's doing fairly well out there. Been an exciting week around our house. Got a new roof and some eaves troughs put on, and looks like we got a bit of rain. I hope it hit the farms all throughout the area too. And the smoke's back, so we continue to pray for the folks up in northern Ontario and Quebec. They get the rain too. Keep the firefighters safe and all, and be with the people who are affected by it. Anyway, we're looking again in the story of Abraham, and this is probably the most troubling story in the whole Old Testament as far as I'm concerned. It's the story of Abraham and Isaac, and God calling Abraham to go and sacrifice his son. This is one of those stories in the Old Testament that, since the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, we look back on that event and we try to see it in light of that. But I'm going to look at things a little bit differently this morning and try to put it back into the context a bit of what was going on in the world of Abraham. But anyway, this is chapter 22, verses 1 to 19. And it starts with, the beginning of it says, after these things. These things are, Abraham has yet again gone before one of the kings that was in the land there and lied to the king about Sarah not being his wife, but rather his sister, in trying to not get the king to prevent the king from killing him and taking Sarah as his wife. And he figured that this king, Abimelech, would, take Sarah away, but at least he wouldn't kill Abraham. And anyway, that's what happened, but a dream happened to Abimelech to trouble him about about Sarah, or he saw the two of them kissing or something. But anyway, Abraham had a habit of doing that whenever he came into the land of another king there in the promised land. It's also following the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, and the story we covered last week of Hagar and Ishmael, Abraham sending them off into the wilderness. Can't help but say it any other way. He only sent them with a loaf of bread and a bottle of water, and he's sending them out in the desert, so he's kind of expecting them to die. Anyway, more about that in a moment. Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 19. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." And Abraham said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac, and he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. And by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Bit of a difficult story to read. Anyway, my father and I, we had some pretty good times together when I was young. Dad taught me all kinds of things. I have the picture to prove it. I remember one Christmas morning when I was about 4 or 5, Dad trying to teach me to play the guitar. He'd gotten me a little cowboy guitar, and he was trying to show me some chords on it. And he taught me more useful things, not to put it that way, but he taught me how to use a hammer and a saw, even how to use a circular saw he could whop my leg off with. He taught me how to frame in a wall and paint a house. He taught me how to mow grass and trim bushes, but he left it to Granddaddy to show me how to butcher a chicken. Yes, I do know how to do that. Dad taught me how to plant and tend a garden. He taught me how to fish. Teach a man to fish. Give a man a fish, you're fed for a day. Teach him to fish, he's fed for life. Dad taught me how to fish. He also taught me the basics of hunting, and I've got an interesting story around that to share. The last time that we went hunting together, it became an odd adventure for us. I was about 15. We did the usual thing. Before sunrise, we got up and we drove to a place called Dan's Camp, and we walked up the trail on a ridge, and he told me to stand by this tree. He walked on a ways further to stand under another tree, and we stood and we watched and we waited and froze. And as typical for us, the sun came up, but the deer didn't. Well, once the trees were glistening in the sunlight, Dad came back and we walked down the ridge trail to get in the car. And we started to put the guns safely away back into the car. He took the shell, he cracked open his shotgun, took out the shell, and closed it back up, but he forgot to check the magazine underneath. The gun held three shells. He forgot to check the magazine. He closed the gun back up. A shell unknowingly went back into the chamber, and with the gun pointed at the ground between us there, he wanted to take the cock off the trigger, so he pulled the trigger, and the next thing we know, kaboom! A round of buckshot hit the ground about 10 inches there right in front of my feet. How I didn't catch the ricochet is a mystery. I think we both lost our nerve for hunting that morning. I did go out a few times in my 30s with my brother, just in case he shot something I could help him drag him back. But as far as I know, Dad never hunted after that. My father was also a man of faith, though it took losing nearly everything for Dad to come to faith in Christ. I was probably 11 or 12 when God touched him. My parents' divorce had finalized by that time, and his work made it so he had to live in another town about a half hour's drive away. So really only get to see him on weekends. He sold insurance, and surprisingly, he was able to build his agency up from scratch all throughout that separation and divorce. and to do so in such a way as to be recognized as one of the most successful agents in the company. Unfortunately, for something I'll call a personality conflict with his regional supervisor, they let him go. And he had to start over from scratch with another company. He was a beaten man there for a while. He told me of a time in the midst of that painful transition with all the feelings of failure and rejection and financial stress and the dysphoria, of how he was out for a drive one day and he took a friend's advice and began to pray. And he said the next thing he knew, the warmest feeling of peace he'd ever felt just washed over him. And he knew Jesus was real, and he knew everything would be okay. He came to faith. Looking towards our reading here, I don't want to compare my dad to Abraham and say he had the faith of Abraham or anything like that. But I will say, and it may not make sense, I don't know, but Dad did not withhold his youngest son, me, from the Lord. He had faith talks with all four of us as children. But with me, he rather strongly encouraged me to pursue what it was that Jesus was calling me to do. And in my case, it was going into pastoral ministry. I guess he saw something in this shy kid with esteem problems that nobody else saw. He wanted me to do what God wanted me to do because he knew it would be best for me, because it's there that I would find meaningful life, purpose, hope. Well, looking at our reading here, Abraham and Isaac, father and son, thinking about that day of hunting that Dad and I had, a morning of hunting, looking at this passage, Abraham and Isaac, they had to take a difficult walk over a period of a couple of days there. And part of the purpose of that walk in the end, I think, was for God through Abraham to pass on to Isaac the live or die nature of faith that was incumbent in the promise that God had made to Abraham to give him a land and make his descendants to be a great nation that would be a blessing to all nations. The faith of Abraham must become Isaac's too. The promise God made to Abraham must be owned by Isaac too. But this promise was not something for Abraham or his descendants to take into their own hands to make happen. They must let God provide. They must let God keep the promise. God has to do it. Well, that walk was a horrific venture. Now, if it would have happened today, most likely the two young men that accompanied them would have contacted Children's Aid, who would have come and removed Isaac from the care of Abraham and Sarah. And then once the whole incident hit the papers, they would have been branded as delusional religious fanatics and shamed into reclusion. But Abraham wasn't delusional. God had really spoken to him directly. It happens, people. God speaks, okay? God had called Abraham by name and asked him to do something really horrific. Sacrifice his own son. You got to ask why. Was it just a test of Abraham's faithfulness? The passage, starts out, in order to test Abraham's faithfulness, or in order to test Abraham's, the way the passage starts. But then for Abraham to carry through with it, just try to imagine how utterly terrified Isaac must have been. And Abraham too. And those two men, they're kind of there in the background saying, Something's going on here. Why was God demanding this obscenely horrible thing? Why was God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, the one through whom the promise God had made to him would be fulfilled? That's a big question. And I just think in the end, it's so complicated. In the end, you just got to step back and scratch your head. Regardless, I think there was at least one point being made there, particularly with Abraham. See, Abraham and Sarah had a problem with God's promise. And the problem was they didn't trust God really to make it happen, and rather tried to make it happen themselves. God's timing just never ever seemed to match up to theirs, and so they would take things into their own hands. And when they did this, they truly made a mess of things. Just a couple of examples. Abraham and his family were nomadic in the land. They wandered around from place to place there in the land that God was giving to them and to his descendants. But God just hadn't given it to them just yet. Well, while he was wandering around, Abraham had a policy that when they passed into the land of another king, another powerful king, he had a policy of telling the king that Sarah was his sister instead of his wife. I mentioned this a while before the reading, actually. And he did this so that the king wouldn't kill him and take Sarah as his own. If the king believed that Sarah was just a sister, he might still take her as his own, but at least then he wouldn't kill Abraham. Abraham would still live. Abraham, time and again, evidenced that he didn't trust God to protect him from the other kings. And so he would take matters into his own hands, and it strained relationships between him and these other kings once they found out that Sarah was his wife and that Abraham had lied to them. And then there's Ishmael. Sarah, being too old to bear children, didn't believe God could give them a child through her, so she gave her slave Hagar to Abraham to bear children in her name, and thus Ishmael. Spoke about this last week. This lack of trusting God comes to a head here with God telling Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. To Abraham, God keeps calling Isaac your son, your only son, which Isaac was not. Ishmael was still Abraham's son, his firstborn son, actually, whom Abraham had just sent away with Hagar into the desert wilderness, where there was the very high risk and likelihood of them dying from exposure. Though it's not noted in the story, there's something you need to be aware of in the historical record of the way things were back then. Canaanite kings had a practice of sacrificing their firstborn sons to one of their gods. Usually the god was named Molech, believing that the sacrifice would make themselves be powerful kings. Give the life of your firstborn, and that God will give you power in return. When Abraham sent Ishmael off into the wilderness to die of exposure, it was, in a sense, a way for Abraham to sacrifice his firstborn, as did those other powerful Canaanite kings who lived in the land that God had promised to give to Abraham. Abraham could make himself a great and powerful king by sacrificing his firstborn, and that would make his descendants more likely to become a great nation, as God had promised. Well, to correct that horrible lack of faith, I would say for God to call Abraham's cards here, God has Abraham put Isaac on the block. So God has Abraham take Isaac on a walk to the place where the Jerusalem temple would one day stand, and accompanied by 2 other men for the purpose of sacrificing Isaac. All that Isaac and these 2 men know is that they're going to make a sacrifice. They're going to worship. But where's the sacrifice? They're going to worship, but where's the sacrifice? In the end, after much obscene horror, everybody learns the Lord will provide. Isaac learned his father would have killed him to stay faithful to his God. And he and Abraham both learned that Isaac is the child of God's promise, and God will let no harm come to him. And in the very least, the way to becoming a great king of a great nation is not sacrificing your children, but through faithfulness to God. I don't know if any of this makes sense to you or not, but it's all I got. Sorry. Well, back to my father and me. When I was 16, I went to spend a weekend with him, and for some strange reason, he started to talk to me about the Lord. And in the midst of that conversation, even though I hadn't been all that churched, he asked me if I'd ever considered becoming a minister. Oddly, that was something that had been floating around in the back of my mind, and that's what I told him. But I also said I would rather consider first being a lawyer or doing something in the field of science, something I felt more gifted towards. It was obvious by my grades I would probably be better at. He shared that he had once felt that he might have been called to be a minister, but he didn't think he was smart enough, so he just didn't pursue it. But he also went on to say that he felt like his work as an insurance agent was like being in the ministry, and that he got to visit a lot of people and just listen to them, their lives and stuff. People he knew knew everybody, it seemed like, and these old farmers around in the area that he sold insurance to. And when he visited them to look over things and assess their needs, it was quite much like a pastoral visit in the way that he would listen to them. I kind of learned pastoral care in a way from him. He saw the insurance business as, an addition to the work of the church, and that insurance picked up where the church left off in being able to help people recover after a major loss. Dad just wanted to know if maybe I had felt the call. He didn't push me on it, but that conversation sprouted a seed that a couple of years later took root. And once it did, Dad, more than anyone else, encouraged me. I hold my father responsible for instilling in me the notion of pursuing what God was calling me to, rather than what I or other people thought I ought to do. He really was the one in the family that I could talk to about my calling and not feel defensive or inadequate or like I had lost my mind or something. He was a good father to me, and what made him good was that he encouraged me to pursue what Jesus wanted for my life, rather than just telling me to go figure out what I wanted to do or what I could do the best and do that to the best of my ability and be successful. He wanted me to pursue what God wanted for my life. Well, to reflect upon this a bit, one of the most important life questions that parents can discuss with their children, and also grandparents with their grandchildren here anymore, is the notion that there is a higher purpose to their lives than just being what they want to be and doing what they want to do. The United States Army years ago had a recruiting slogan, and I think it's still around a bit, a recruiting slogan that was as effective as Nike's Just Do It. It was be all that you can be. And the song was be all that you can be in the Army. Military service aside, the idea of being all that you can be is pretty prevalent in our culture as something we esteem, a goal we aspire to. Be all that you can be. I don't think it's at all wrong to aspire to be all that you can be. So many people today, particularly young people, seem to lack this aspiration. Or I just rather want to say that it's not that they lack aspiration, it's just this hopelessness that pervades them about their future. This hopelessness really just prevents them from stepping up, being all that they can be. I just offer the question here, who or what defines what that all is? Who says, what is it? What is this all that you can be? This question is especially pertinent in a culture whose primary source of what it calls truth with a capital T, the primary source for that is what feels true to me from what I gather from social media. Hey, feeling is not fact. Because it feels like truth doesn't mean it is. We, the disciples of Jesus, we have a calling incumbent to us in this culture that we offer Jesus and his way of the cross as the definition of what all is. This requires that we ourselves live accordingly so that the truth we offer as Jesus is credible. Young people today are growing up in a world that just seems so hopeless. They are saddled with problems as big and as complex as this planet and its weather systems. These things getting out of hand because we are addicted to fossil fuels. Not to mention what's going on in economies and stuff like that. We are saddling our youth with a world of trouble. They live in a world for which a fitting metaphor of the way things are is that of those kings of Canaan sacrificing their children so that they themselves, not the children, can have all that they can have. We want our children to be all that they can be, but the world we are saddling them with is ready to implode because we have gone about being all that we can be in very self-serving and might I add, hedonistic ways. Hedonism is just doing what feels pleasurable to me. We haven't been pursuing happiness. We've been pursuing pleasure. A big difference there. Anyway, what my father did in pointing me in the direction of seeking what it was that God wanted me to be and do is, I think, a paramount task in parenthood and in grandparenthood today. That there is a peace and a love that surpasses understanding yet heals when it touches us is something we need to encourage our young people to seek. We can't force it upon them. We can't coerce them into following Jesus. We just need to share the one that we have found and testify to his love and faithfulness and live accordingly. It's the way of the cross that leads home. The restlessness, the hopelessness that our young people are saddled with. Well, I think Jesus has the way through it. The way of the cross leads home. Amen. Well, happy Canada Day. Forgot to mention that. Hope you all have a good week. I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite hymns. I heard the voice of Jesus say. So have a good week and God bless. I heard the voice of Jesus say, "Come unto me and rest. Lay down now, weary one, lay down thy head upon my breast." I came to Jesus as I was, weary and worn and sad. I found in him a resting place, and he has made me glad. I heard the voice of Jesus say, "Behold, I freely give the living water, thirsty one, stoop down and drink and live." I came to Jesus and I drank of that life-giving stream. My thirst was quenched, my soul revived, and now I live in him. I heard the voice of Jesus say, "I am this dark world's light. Look unto me, thy morn shall rise, and all thy day be bright." I looked to Jesus and I found in him my star, my sun. And in that light of life I'll walk till traveling day